One man stopped asking about home, stopped speaking about return, stopped mentioning the life he once had, while everyone else kept counting the days, and a quiet question began to form in the silence. What happens when a person lets go of the place he came from? From the beginning of his captivity, he had spoken about home in the same way most of the other prisoners did, referring to it in fragments, memories, and small details that kept the idea of return alive in daily conversation, as if speaking about familiar streets, family routines, and ordinary moments was a way of protecting a part of himself that the camp could not reach. And for a long time, those references formed a quiet emotional thread that connected his present life inside the camp to a past life that still felt real. In the early months, his memories were specific, grounded in ordinary scenes rather than grand ideas, as he described places, meals, habits, and routines that belonged to civilian life, using them as points of psychological stability in a world that had suddenly become rigid, structured, and controlled by external rules. Over time, however, the way he spoke about home began to change in subtle ways that were not immediately obvious to others, because the shift did not happen as a sudden silence, but as a gradual fading of detail, where stories became shorter, references became less specific, and memories lost their emotional color. The images he once described with clarity slowly became vague, and the emotional weight they carried began to weaken, as if the connection between his daily life in the camp and his past life outside, it was slowly thinning without anyone noticing the moment it started. Life inside the camp continued to impose its own structure, rhythm, and logic, organizing time through routines, work details, and schedules that required constant attention to the present environment, leaving little mental space for sustained connection to a distant past. His days became defined by tasks, movements, and repetition rather than reflection, and the mental energy that had once gone into remembering and imagining was gradually redirected toward adapting, functioning, and maintaining balance inside the system that now controlled every part of daily existence. As this structure settled into his life, the memories of home began to lose their role as emotional anchors and became more like distant references that no longer shaped his daily thinking or his sense of identity. The person he had been before captivity still existed in memory, but that memory no longer functioned as a living connection to a future he was preparing to return to, and instead became a static image of a life that no longer felt continuous with the one he was living. Other prisoners continued to speak about home as a destination, a future point of return, and a place they were moving towards psychologically even while remaining physically confined. But for him, home slowly stopped functioning as a direction and began to exist only as a concept without movement attached to it. His conversations shifted away from the past and the future and became increasingly centered on the present environment, the routines of the camp, the details of daily work, and the immediate realities of life inside the fences. The change was not dramatic and not visible as a clear decision, but it could be observed in behavior rather than words. As he stopped initiating conversations about return, stopped asking questions about life beyond the camp, and stopped engaging with the future-oriented energy that shaped the social atmosphere around him. Instead, his attention became increasingly focused on the internal order of the camp itself, on the predictable patterns that structured each day, and on the familiar rhythm that made life inside the camp psychologically manageable. Home did not disappear from his mind, but it lost its power to organize his thoughts, his emotions, and his sense of direction, because the structure of daily life inside the camp had become more immediate, more stable, and more psychologically present than any distant memory. The idea of return no longer shaped his inner world, not through rejection or resistance, but through gradual detachment, as the connection between past identity and present existence weakened through long-term adaptation to a contained environment. By the time others began to speak more intensely about departure, transport, and return, his silence on the subject had already become part of his daily behavior, not as a sign of despair, but as a sign of psychological reorientation, where the past no longer functioned as a foundation for the future and the present had become the primary reference point for meaning and identity. In this early shift, the first clear change in his inner world had already taken place, not as a dramatic break, but as a quiet transformation in which the idea of home stopped being a destination and became only a memory, leaving his psychological life increasingly centered on the structure, rhythm, and reality of the world he was living in rather than the one he had left behind. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As time passed, the silence around the idea of home did not remain an isolated change in his speech, but slowly became part of a broader transformation in the way he related to memory, identity, and the future, as if the mental space that had once been occupied by thoughts of return was gradually being filled by the structure and demands of daily life inside the camp. The routines of captivity continued to shape his days through repetition, predictability, and constant engagement with the present environment, leaving little room for sustained connection to a past that no longer felt psychologically active. His attention became increasingly absorbed by the immediate realities of camp life, by the details of work assignments, the rhythm of daily schedules, and the practical demands of survival within a controlled system that required continuous adaptation. The more his mind adjusted to this structure, the less emotional space remained for a future that had no clear shape, no defined timeline, and no concrete form, making the idea of return feel distant, abstract, and increasingly disconnected from his lived experience. Other prisoners continued to anchor their identities to the idea of going home, speaking about families, towns, and former lives as points of emotional reference that gave meaning to their endurance. But for him, those references began to lose their organizing power. The stories of home that once carried emotional weight became background noise rather than personal direction, existing in conversation without shaping his internal world. His sense of self slowly reorganized around the present rather than the past, around what he was doing rather than who he had been, and around what surrounded him rather than what he remembered. The camp environment, with its routines, spaces, and rhythms, became the primary framework through which he understood daily existence, while his former life became a distant mental image that no longer guided his behavior or expectations. This shift was not driven by fear, despair, or resignation, but by adaptation, as the mind aligned itself with what was stable, immediate, and predictable rather than with what was distant, uncertain, and undefined. The familiar structure of the camp offered clarity and coherence, while the idea of home offered only memory without direction, making it increasingly difficult for his mind to attach meaning or intention to the concept of return. The more deeply he adapted to the present structure, the weaker the emotional connection to the past became, not because he rejected it, but because it no longer served a functional role in organizing his daily life. Memory became passive rather than active, existing as background knowledge rather than as a guiding force. This internal change could be seen in subtle shifts in his behavior, as he stopped engaging with conversations about post-war life, stopped speculating about future plans, and stopped orienting his thinking toward what came next, focusing instead on the immediate structure of daily routines, tasks, and responsibilities. His world became increasingly centered on what was happening now rather than on what might happen later. The future, once imagined as a return to a familiar life, gradually lost its psychological clarity, while the present gained coherence and stability, creating an internal environment where continuity felt more real than transition and structure felt more meaningful than possibility. The idea of home did not vanish, but lost its power to define direction, identity, and purpose, becoming a distant reference rather than a living destination. By this stage, the change was no longer only about silence and conversation, but about a deeper internal reorientation, where his inner world no longer revolved around memory and anticipation, but around routine, presence, and adaptation. The camp had become the center of his psychological reality, not because it was chosen, but because it was lived, while home had become an image, not a direction. In this growing separation between past identity and present existence, the foundation of his future slowly dissolved, not through a single moment of loss, but through continuous adaptation to a world that demanded presence rather than memory and survival rather than imagination, leaving his inner life increasingly anchored to the structure of the camp and increasingly detached from the idea of return. As this internal reorientation continued, the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming began to widen in ways that were not visible on the surface of daily life, but were deeply present in the structure of his thinking and perception, as if his identity was slowly being rebuilt around the present environment rather than carried forward from the past. The camp no longer felt like a place he was passing through on the way to something else, but a place where life itself was unfolding, where time was experienced through repetition rather than expectation, and through routine rather than anticipation. His memories of home did not disappear, but they became increasingly disconnected from emotion and intention, existing more as neutral images than as sources of longing or direction, as if the emotional charge that once gave them meaning had slowly drained away through long-term exposure to a world that demanded constant attention to the present. What had once felt like a living connection to another life now felt like a distant archive of images that no longer shaped his decisions, his behavior, or his sense of self. The structure of camp life continued to reinforce this shift, as every day required adaptation to rules, schedules, and routines that left little space for inward reflection or future-oriented thinking, forcing the mind to remain focused on immediate tasks, immediate needs, and immediate realities. Over time, this constant engagement with the present environment reshaped his inner world, making immediacy feel more real than memory and familiarity feel more stable than possibility. Other prisoners still spoke of the future as something tangible and approaching, building their identities around the idea of return and organizing their inner lives around the hope of reintegration. But for him, the future remained abstract, distant, and psychologically undefined, lacking the emotional clarity needed to function as a source of motivation. Their conversations about what they would do, where they would go, and who they would become again passed through his awareness without taking root, because those imagined lives no longer felt connected to the person he had become inside the camp. His attention remained anchored to the physical environment around him, to the rhythms of daily movement, to the familiar spaces of work, rest, and routine, and to the predictable order that shaped each day. The fences, the barracks, the paths between work details, and the common areas became the primary reference points of his lived reality, while the world beyond them remained an idea rather than an experience. This growing focus on the present reshaped his sense of continuity, making the present feel complete in itself rather than incomplete without the future, and making survival, stability, and balance more important than transition, change, or aspiration. The idea of becoming someone else again, of rebuilding a former identity, or of returning to a previous life no longer felt necessary or even coherent because the internal structure of his mind had adapted to a different way of existing. The past lost its authority as a guide, not through rejection, but through irrelevance, because it no longer matched the psychological reality of his daily life. The future lost its pull, not through fear, but through distance, because it no longer felt emotionally accessible or personally meaningful. Between these two fading forces, the present became dominant, shaping identity, perception, and meaning through continuity rather than through transformation. This internal state did not feel like loss, and it did not feel like surrender, because it was not experienced as giving something up, but as settling into a stable psychological condition where daily life made sense without the need for projection or anticipation. His inner world became quieter, more contained, and more focused on what was rather than what had been or what might be. Without any clear moment of realization, without any conscious decision, and without any dramatic turning point, his identity continued to reorganize itself around the structure of the camp, the rhythm of routine, and the logic of daily existence, allowing a new psychological stability to form that no longer depended on memory of the past or expectation of the future. In this stage of transformation, the silence about home was no longer only a change in speech, but a sign of a deeper internal shift, where the concept of return no longer functioned as a source of meaning, and the idea of the future no longer served as a foundation for identity, leaving his psychological life centered almost entirely in the present structure of the world he now inhabited. As this new internal stability settled more deeply into his daily existence, the structure of camp life continued to shape his perception in ways that were subtle but constant, reinforcing a psychological world in which the present no longer felt like a temporary condition, but like a complete and self-contained reality. The routines that once felt imposed now felt familiar. The schedules that once felt restrictive now felt predictable, and the environment that once felt foreign now felt internally coherent. Not because it had become humane or kind, but because it had become known, understandable, and psychologically organized. The camp no longer functioned in his mind as a place he was waiting to leave, but as the place where life was actually happening, where time was experienced through repetition rather than anticipation, and where meaning was created through continuity rather than expectation. His days were no longer oriented toward what would come later, but toward what was already present, as each task, each movement, and each routine reinforced a sense of stability that required no projection into the future to feel complete. The idea of home, which once carried emotional weight and psychological direction, now existed only as a distant reference point without practical relevance, no longer shaping his choices, his attention, or his sense of identity. It was not rejected and not denied, but simply disconnected from the structure of his daily life, as if it belonged to a different version of himself that no longer aligned with the person he had become inside the camp. Other prisoners continued to orient their identities toward return, building their inner worlds around anticipation and reintegration. But for him, the concept of return no longer functioned as a meaningful direction, because the internal continuity between his past self and his present self had weakened to the point where the future no longer felt like a continuation, but like an abstract idea without psychological grounding. His attention remained focused on the immediate environment, on the familiar paths between work details, on the daily rhythm of tasks and rest, and on the predictable order that structured every moment, creating an internal sense of coherence that did not depend on change or movement to feel stable. The physical space of the camp remained central to his lived experience, not as a symbol of captivity, but as the environment in which his identity now operated. This orientation toward the present reshaped his emotional world, making stability feel more meaningful than possibility and familiarity feel more real than aspiration. The future no longer appeared as something to move toward, and the past no longer appeared as something to return to, leaving his psychological life anchored in a narrow but stable present. The absence of future-oriented thinking did not create despair, and the loss of past-oriented identity did not create grief, because the internal structure of his mind had adapted to a different form of meaning, one based on balance, routine, and psychological containment rather than on projection, ambition, or transformation. His behavior reflected this internal condition in consistent ways, as he remained disengaged from planning conversations, distant from discussions about post-war life, and uninvolved in future-oriented expectations, not through isolation or withdrawal, but through quiet indifference to narratives that no longer resonated with his internal reality. The camp did not become home in an emotional sense, and the outside world did not become an enemy in a psychological sense, because neither concept held dominance over his inner life. Instead, his internal world existed in a state of containment, where meaning came from order, identity came from routine, and stability came from continuity, without any clear decision, without any spoken refusal, and without any dramatic turning point. A condition formed in which movement no longer felt necessary for meaning and change no longer felt necessary for identity, allowing his psychological life to settle into a quiet equilibrium where the present was sufficient and the future was unnecessary. In this stage of his transformation, the silence about home had evolved into something deeper than the absence of words, becoming a structural feature of his inner world, where the idea of return no longer functioned as a direction, and the idea of the future no longer functioned as a foundation for self, leaving his identity fully anchored in the structure, rhythm, and reality of the life he was already living. As this internal condition continued to stabilize, his daily life inside the camp unfolded with a sense of continuity that no longer felt transitional, but settled, structured, and complete in itself, as if the psychological movement that once connected his present to a future beyond the fences had slowly dissolved into a form of stillness where nothing else was required for life to feel coherent. The routines that shaped his days no longer felt like temporary arrangements, and the structure that organized his existence no longer felt like a waiting system, but like a stable framework in which identity, meaning, and balance could exist without reference to what lay outside the camp. The idea of return remained present as information, but not as direction, because it no longer shaped his attention, his choices, or his internal sense of purpose, existing instead as a distant concept disconnected from the reality that defined his daily life. Home was no longer a destination in his mind, and the future was no longer a horizon that pulled him forward because the internal structure of his identity had reorganized itself around the present environment, the familiar rhythms of routine, and the predictable logic of daily existence. Inside the camp, life continued to offer psychological clarity through order, repetition, and structure, creating a world that made sense on a daily level, while the world outside remained undefined, abstract, and emotionally unformed, making it difficult for his mind to attach meaning, intention, or desire to anything beyond the boundaries of his immediate experience. The known environment carried weight, while the unknown future carried none. Other prisoners still organized their inner lives around anticipation, preparation, and reintegration, But for him, those orientations no longer resonated because his internal world no longer operated within a framework of progression or change, but within a framework of stability and containment. Their conversations about what would come next passed through his awareness without shaping his identity, because the future they imagined did not intersect with the psychological structure he now inhabited. His sense of self became increasingly defined by presence rather than projection, by routine rather than aspiration, and by continuity rather than transformation, creating an internal condition in which life no longer felt like a process of becoming, but a state of being. The past no longer functioned as a foundation for direction, and the future no longer functioned as a source of meaning, leaving the present as the only psychologically relevant space. This condition did not feel like loss, and it did not feel like surrender because it was not experienced as giving something up, but as settling into a form of balance where daily life felt internally organized and psychologically stable. The absence of longing did not create emptiness, and the absence of ambition did not create despair because the internal structure of his mind had adapted to a different way of existing, one based on containment rather than movement. Remaining was no longer a decision, and leaving was no longer a goal, because both concepts had lost psychological authority over his inner world. The camp did not become a place of belonging, and the outside world did not become a place of rejection, because neither held emotional dominance over his identity. Instead, his inner life existed in a quiet equilibrium where meaning came from order, identity came from routine, and stability came from continuity. In this final stage of transformation, the silence about home was no longer simply the absence of words, but the presence of a different psychological reality, one in which return no longer functioned as a purpose and the future no longer functioned as a necessity, allowing his life to continue within a contained internal world where the present was enough, the structure was sufficient, and the need to leave had quietly disappeared without conflict, without resistance, and without any visible moment of decision. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the disappearance of home from his inner world, because the change had already taken place slowly, quietly, and without resistance, as his mind had reorganized itself around presence rather than projection, routine rather than anticipation, and stability rather than movement. What remained was not a rejection of the past and not a refusal of the future, but a psychological state in which identity no longer depended on where he came from or where he was going, because meaning had become fully contained within the structure of daily life itself. Home did not vanish as a memory, but it lost its power as a direction, no longer shaping his thoughts, his emotions, or his sense of purpose, existing only as a distant image disconnected from the life he was living. The future did not disappear as an idea, but it lost its authority over his inner world, no longer functioning as a source of motivation or identity, because the present had become psychologically complete in itself. This was not the story of forgetting, and not the story of surrender, but the story of adaptation, where the human mind gradually shifts its center of meaning from what is distant to what is near, from what is imagined to what is lived, and from what is remembered to what is repeated. Without a single decision, without a clear moment of change, and without any visible turning point, a new internal reality formed in which life no longer required return in order to feel whole. He did not stop caring about home because it lost its value, but because his life no longer depended on it for meaning, as the structure, rhythm, and familiarity of daily existence had quietly become enough. In this way, the silence about home was not emptiness, but completion, and the absence of return was not loss, but a transformation in how identity, meaning, and existence were organized within the human mind. This is not the story of a man who lost his past, but the story of a man whose present became strong enough to replace it, showing how captivity can reshape not only where a person lives, but how a person understands life itself, until the need for return fades, not through fear or resistance, but through the quiet power of psychological adaptation. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.